In the winter of 1888, an old man lay dying in a narrow room above a shuttered shop on Cornhill Street in Boston. His hands, once said to be the most precise in the whole of New England, had finally gone still. His eyes were failing. And for 3 days he had refused to speak to anyone except the young man who sat beside his bed, a 19-year-old apprentice named Samuel Pell. On the final night, the old man gripped Samuel's wrist with a strength that had no business being left in a body that thin. He pulled the boy close, and he whispered something that Samuel would never repeat in full for the rest of his life. He wrote down only fragments of it, decades later, in the margins of a ledger that surfaced at an estate sale in 1961. The old man's name was Elias Thorne, and depending on who you ask, he was either the last honest clockmaker in the city or the last man alive who still remembered how the old world actually... I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. It worked. Here is the part that no one has ever been able to explain. When Elias Thorne was buried, the city of Boston had no record of when he was born. No baptism, no ship manifest, no census before 1820 that carries his name. He appears in the story of the city fully formed, already a master of a craft that, by the accounts of the people who knew him, he seemed to have learned somewhere that no longer existed. This is the story of that somewhere. And it is the story of what Elias Thorne believed had been quietly taken from all of us. To understand why one dying watchmaker matters, you first have to understand what a watchmaker even was before the year 1820. Not what we picture now, not a man who swaps the battery in your wristwatch. In the world Thorne came out of, the person who could measure time was one of the most powerful figures in any city. He set the rhythm of the harbour, he set the rhythm of the mills, the church bells, the markets, the courts. If you controlled time, you controlled labour. And if you controlled labour, you controlled the flow of money through an entire town. The watchmaker sat at the exact centre of the economy, and almost nobody today remembers that this was ever true. There is a document from colonial New England, a set of guild ordinances that most people have never heard of, and it reads almost like the constitution of a small hidden country. It set the price of an hour of skilled work. It set who was allowed to teach and who was allowed to learn, and how long a boy had to serve before he could call himself a maker. It fixed the standards a finished piece had to meet before it could carry a master's mark. And it did all of this with no bank, no government charter, and no permission from anyone standing above it. That is the world Elias Thorne came out of, a world where a small brotherhood of men who made real things held the right to decide what real things were worth. Now ask yourself when the last time was that the people who actually make things held that right. If the honest answer is never, not once in your whole lifetime, then you already understand exactly what Thorne was mourning. The Boston that Elias Thorne described to his apprentice in the long quiet afternoons when the shop had no customers was not the Boston in the school books. He spoke of a city of stone that stood before the wooden colonial town everyone agreed had been there. He spoke of buildings with foundations far too deep and far too precise for the tools the settlers were supposed to have owned. He spoke of streets that seemed to have been laid out by someone who understood the movement of the sky, aligned to angles that no farmer and no fisherman would ever have bothered with. And he spoke, more than anything else, about the machines. According to Thorne, the true clocks of the old city did not run on springs and falling weights the way the textbooks insist. They ran on something already present in the air itself. He called it the current. Sometimes he called it the breath. He told Samuel that a properly built timepiece, made the old way, never needed winding, because it drew what it needed from the atmosphere the same way a sail draws from the wind. He said he had held one of these devices in his own hands as a young man. He said it had been faintly warm to the touch, even though nothing inside it burned, even though it had no fire and no fuel and no spring wound tight against the day. Samuel pressed him on it once. How, he asked, could a thing keep time forever with nothing driving it? And Thorne, according to the notes, did not answer the way a fraud answers. He did not spin a tale. He got irritated. He said the question was backwards. He said the modern mind assumes that motion has to be forced, that everything winds down, that you have to keep feeding a machine or it dies. But the old makers, he said, did not force motion. They invited it. They built a shape that the current in the air wanted to move through the way a canyon invites the wind, and then they simply got out of the way. A spring, he said, is what you use when you no longer understand the current and have to store your own little pocket of force to fake it. He called the mainspring a confession that we had forgotten how the world actually feeds a machine and had started carrying our own small supply of borrowed motion around with us, winding it up every single morning like men paying rent on something that used to be free. Now, it would be easy to file all of this under the ramblings of a dying man, and for almost 100 years that is exactly what everyone did. But then people started looking closely at the objects that Thorne actually left behind, and that is the moment this story stops being comfortable. The 1961 estate ledger is the strangest artifact in the whole account. It is a bound merchant's book, the kind a shopkeeper would use to log sales and repairs. Most of it is ordinary: dates, names, small sums, a pocket watch cleaned here, a mantel clock regulated there. But scattered through the back third of the book are entries in a second hand, smaller and tighter, that do not describe repairs at all. They describe commissions, and the commissions do not make sense. One entry records a device built to, and this is the phrasing copied out of the book, hold the charge of a full day without draw. Another describes a movement made with no mainspring and no pendulum, only what the writer calls a resonant core. A third lists materials that a Boston watchmaker in the 1850s should never have been able to source, described in terms that read less like a shopping list and more like a recipe half remembered from a place that no longer sold anything. And besides several of these entries is a single repeated note: old method, do not record the buyer. So, who were the buyers? There is one entry in particular that people keep coming back to. It is dated to the spring of 1859, and it describes in that cramped second hand a device commissioned by a client listed only as the Harbour Trust. The specification asks for a movement that will, in the words of the book itself, run true through a full change of season without adjustment, drawing on the standing charge of the room. Beside it, a price. And the price is staggering. It is more in the money of the day than the entire recorded value of every ordinary repair in the front half of the ledger combined. Someone paid Elias Thorne a small fortune to build a clock that needed no winding and no correction and no power source anyone could name, and then that someone made sure their real name was never written down. You do not spend that kind of money on a curiosity. You spend it on something that works. That is where the economic thread of this story begins to pull tight, and it pulls in a direction most people find genuinely uncomfortable. Between roughly 1820 and 1850, the entire structure of value in the American city changed. And it changed in a way that we have been taught to call progress, but which looked, to the men living through it, a great deal more like a takeover. Before that window, wealth in a place like Boston was tied to real, made things: ships, grain, cloth, timepieces, tools. The value of your labour was something you could hold. The craftsman guilds, the old brotherhoods of makers, were the institutions that protected the price of skilled work, and they had done so for centuries. A master watchmaker did not answer to a bank. He answered to his guild, to his reputation, and to the accuracy of his own hands. Then, in the space of about a single generation, the guilds were gutted. The word we use for it is industrialization, and we say it like it was weather, like it just happened, like nobody chose it. But somebody chose it. The system that replaced the old one did not measure value in made things anymore. It measured value in paper, in notes. Value stopped being something you created with your hands and became something you were loaned, at interest, by men who made nothing at all. And the mechanism of that shift is not hidden. You can trace it. In the old craft economy, when you needed capital to expand your workshop, you went to your guild, or to other makers, and the arrangement was between equals who understood the work and shared the risk of it. In the new economy, you went to a bank, and the bank did not care whether you were the finest watchmaker in Boston or the worst. The bank cared about collateral and about interest, and about the one thing a craftsman could never truly provide, which was the guarantee of endless growing repayment. A man who makes clocks by hand cannot grow endlessly. There are only so many hours in his day, and only so much skill in his fingers. But debt has to grow, or the whole structure built on top of it collapses. So the new system had no real use for the craftsman. It had use only for the factory, which could grow, which could bolt on 100 more machines and 1,000 more hands, and produce more this year than last, and more next year than this, forever, feeding the interest that fed the banks that had, in a single generation, quietly become the most powerful institutions in the entire country. The craftsman was not beaten in a fair fight. He was simply declared no longer useful by the people who had just seized the right to decide what usefulness even meant. Elias Thorne believed this was not an accident. He believed it was the point. He told Samuel that the old craft economy had one fatal flaw from the perspective of the people who wanted to control it. It could not be owned from the top. You cannot own a man's skill. You cannot foreclose on the knowledge in his fingers. As long as value lived in the made object and in the hands that made it, there was a hard ceiling on how much power any bank or any state could gather. So the made object had to be devalued, and the fastest way to devalue skilled work was to flood the world with a cheaper substitute and then rewrite the story so that everyone believed the substitute was better. That is the revisionist claim at the heart of this whole account, and I want to state it plainly so you can decide for yourself what to do with it. The version of history we were handed says that the old world was primitive, and that clever inventors dragged us out of the mud into the light. Thorne's version says almost the exact opposite. He said the old world already had the light. He said something happened between 1820 and the great fires of the later century that broke it, buried it, and priced it out of existence. And he said the watchmakers were among the last people who could prove it, because their work was the one thing that could not lie. A clock is either accurate or it is not. You cannot argue a clock into being wrong. And that brings us to the fires. If you start pulling on the thread of 19th century American cities, you run into something odd very quickly. An extraordinary number of them burned, not once but again and again, in enormous city-consuming fires across a stretch of decades that lines up almost perfectly with the window we have been discussing. Boston itself burned catastrophically in 1872. Great sections of the old downtown, the dense knot of stone and brick and record and archive, were gone in a matter of hours. And when the city was rebuilt, it was rebuilt to a new plan, in a new style, by new interests, with new money. Now, the standard explanation for these fires is simple. Cities were made of wood, people were careless, and accidents happen. And that is a perfectly reasonable explanation, right up until you notice how much of what burned was specifically the oldest buildings, the oldest neighborhoods, the archives, the records. Thorne told Samuel that the fires were not how the old world ended. The fires were how the evidence of the old world was erased after the fact, so that the generation being raised on the new money would have nothing left to compare it to. Burn the buildings, and you burn the proof. And a people with no proof will believe whatever story you print in their school books. And it was not only Boston, Chicago in 1871, Portland before it. Great swaths of dozens of American cities, all within a few short decades of one another, all reduced to ash and then rebuilt to modern plans in modern styles with modern money. The official story treats each one as its own isolated accident. A lantern kicked over in a barn here, a careless spark there. And each one, taken entirely on its own, is perfectly believable. It is only when you lay them side by side and notice how consistently it was the oldest fabric of the oldest cities that went up that the pattern starts to feel less like a run of terrible luck and more like a clearing of the ground. Thorn never claimed to know who lit them. He was far too careful a man for that. He only pointed at the timing and asked the one question the official story never quite manages to answer. Why is it always the old world that burns and almost never the new? I know how that sounds. I do. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. And there is a version of this channel that would just tell you it is all true and move on. But the honest thing to say is that we cannot verify most of it, and the account rests on the word of one dying man and a ledger nobody can fully authenticate. What I can tell you is that the pattern Thorn pointed at is real. The guilds really did collapse. The banks really did rise in exactly those years. The cities really did burn. Whether those facts are threads of one deliberate design or just the ordinary chaos of a century is the exact question that Elias Thorn spent his last breath trying to answer. Because by the end, he was alone. That is the part of the story that gets to me the most. By the 1870s, Thorn was already an anachronism. The mass-produced watch had arrived, cheap and standardized and good enough, pouring out of factories in Connecticut and Massachusetts by the tens of thousands. A working man could buy a decent timepiece for the price of a meal. And in the face of that, a man who built clocks by hand, one at a time, the old way, over months, was not a craftsman anymore. He was a curiosity. His shop on Cornhill Street grew quiet. The commissions in that second, tighter hand stopped appearing in the ledger sometime around 1873, the year after the Great Fire, as if whoever had been buying those strange devices had suddenly decided it was no longer safe to be seen doing so. Samuel Pell came to him in 1885. The boy had no family to speak of and a natural gift for small, precise things, and Thorn, who had turned away every apprentice for a decade, took him in without a word of explanation. For 3 years the old man taught him not just the visible craft, the cleaning and the regulating and the fitting of gears, but something underneath it, something Samuel would later struggle to even name. Thorn taught him to listen to a movement. He taught him that a clock has a voice, and that a healthy one and a sick one do not sound the same, and that if you learned to hear it well enough, you could tell what was wrong with a mechanism from across a room, in the dark, without ever opening the case. That skill, the listening, is the part Samuel could never fully explain to anyone afterward, and it is the part that convinced him in the end that Thorn had not simply been lying about the rest of it. Because it worked. Samuel could do it. He learned to sit in a room full of ticking movements and pick out the single one that was failing, the way a shepherd hears the one wrong note in a whole field of bells. He wrote that Thorn told him this was the smallest surviving fragment of the old craft, the last technique that had made it through the collapse intact, and that it was nothing at all compared to what the old makers had once been able to do. If a man can learn to hear a sickness in a gear, Thorn said, then imagine what a man could hear who had been taught from the time he could walk to listen to the current itself. Imagine what he could build. Imagine what he could feed, and what he would never again have to wind. And late at night, when the lesson was done, Thorn would talk. He would talk about the current in the air. He would talk about the stone city under the wooden one. He would talk about a time when a man's work was his own, and could not be bought out from under him by people who had never made a single thing in their lives. Samuel wrote, decades later, that he had assumed most of it was the loneliness talking, an old man telling stories to keep the quiet away. He wrote that he regretted that assumption for the rest of his life, because on the last night the stories stopped and something else took their place. The account of that final night comes entirely from Samuel, set down in the margins of that recovered ledger many years after the fact, when he himself was an old man. He wrote that Thorn had been unable to speak clearly for 2 days, drifting, feverish, his words coming apart. And then, near midnight, he went suddenly, completely still and clear. His eyes opened. He looked straight at Samuel, and Samuel said it was like being looked at by someone 40 years younger, someone sharp and awake and afraid. Thorn took the boy's wrist, and he whispered. Samuel never wrote down the whole of it. He said he could not, that some of it he did not understand, and some of it he understood too well and would not commit to paper for fear of who might one day read it. But he preserved 3 fragments, just 3. And they have been argued over ever since. The first fragment was this: they did not lose the knowledge, they priced it. And the second was this: everything you were taught about when the world began is off by 100 years, and the 100 years they took is the only 100 that mattered. And the third fragment, the last thing Elias Thorn is recorded to have said before he died, was the strangest of all, and I am going to give it to you exactly as Samuel wrote it, without softening it. It runs, the core is still in the wall. The pine, wind it once, and it will remember. Do not let them tell you time was ever theirs to sell. And then he was gone. Now, what do we do with that? The first fragment, the one about pricing rather than losing knowledge, fits everything Thorn had said for years. It is the economic argument in its most compressed form. The claim is not that the old techniques were destroyed. The claim is that they were made economically impossible, priced out, undercut, and left to die on the vine while a cheaper story took their place. You do not need to burn a book if you can make sure no one can afford to read it and no one is taught it is worth reading. That is a colder kind of erasure, and if it is true, it is far more effective than any fire. Consider what actually happened to the knowledge itself. A master watchmaker in 1800 held techniques in his hands that had been passed down through the guild for generations, methods you could not buy and could not read, that lived only in the doing of them. When the guilds broke and the long apprenticeships ended and the factories offered a boy a wage to stand at one station and cut one gear all day, that chain of transmission simply stopped. Not because anyone burned it, because no one could any longer afford the years it took to pass it on. Why serve 7 years to learn the whole of a craft when a factory would pay you tomorrow to learn 1/100th of it? Within 2 generations, the whole of the old knowledge had been squeezed into the heads of a handful of dying men, and when they died, it died with them, and not a single fire was ever required. That is what Thorn meant when he said they priced it. You do not have to destroy a thing if you can simply make it too expensive to keep alive. The second fragment is where this leaves ordinary history behind entirely, and I understand if this is where you get off the ride. The claim that the calendar itself is wrong by roughly a century is one of the most persistent ideas in this whole field, and there is no mainstream evidence for it that survives serious scrutiny. But it is worth understanding why the idea is so seductive to people who look closely at the old world. It is because the old world, again and again, looks too finished, too soon. The buildings are too refined. The infrastructure is too ambitious for the population that supposedly built it. And when something looks like it took longer than the official timeline allows, the mind reaches for a missing century to hide the extra time in. Thorn was reaching for that missing century. Whether it was ever really there is something no ledger can prove, but it is the third fragment that keeps people up at night. The core is still in the wall. Samuel Pell spent the next several years, by his own account, trying to figure out which wall. Thorn had lived and worked in the same building on Cornhill Street for as long as anyone could remember. After his death, the shop passed through a series of owners, was renovated, was leased and released, and at some point in the early 20th century, the entire block was redeveloped and the old structure came down. If there was ever a core in a wall, a resonant device sealed into the fabric of that building the old way, drawing quietly on the current in the air and waiting to be wound just once so that it would remember, then it went into a demolition cart along with everything else, unrecognized, unrecorded, and gone. Or it did not. Because here is the detail that Samuel added at the very end of his notes, almost as an afterthought. In handwriting, he clearly did not want to make bold. He wrote that in the last week of Thorn's life, before the old man lost the power of clear speech, a well-dressed stranger had come to the shop twice. Samuel had not been permitted to hear those conversations, but after the second visit Thorn had spent an entire night alone in the back room with the door barred, and in the morning there was a fine grey dust on the floor of a kind Samuel did not recognise, and a section of the rear wall that had not been there the week before, freshly plastered, and still faintly warm to the touch. Still faintly warm, even though nothing inside it burned. We will never know what was behind that wall, or whether there was anything at all. The building is gone. Thorn is gone. Samuel Pell died in 1949, and the ledger with his notes did not surface until 1961, at which point every person who could have confirmed a single word of it was already in the ground. What we are left with is not proof. What we are left with is a shape. The shape of a man who insisted right up to his final breath that the world we live in was built on a story, and that the story was written by the people who benefited most from us believing it. And maybe that is the real inheritance Elias Thorn left behind. Not a device in a wall, not a secret formula for pulling power out of the open air, but a question, sharpened to a fine point and pressed into the hands of a 19-year-old boy who would carry it for the rest of his life. The question is simple, and it is the same question that the guilds asked, and the craftsmen asked, and the last honest makers of a vanishing world asked, before the paper and the interest and the great convenient fires swept the whole argument away. Who decided what your work is worth, and why did you agree? Because think about the third fragment one more time. Do not let them tell you time was ever theirs to sell. Strip away the mystery, the warm walls, and the resonant cores, and the missing century, and you are left with something that is not mysterious at all. You are left with a plain economic observation from a man who watched it happen. Time used to belong to the people who measured it for themselves. Then it was standardized, centralized, and sold back to them, in shifts and wages and schedules and debts, by institutions that produced nothing and owned everything. That part is not conspiracy. That part is just what happened. Thorn simply refused to call it progress. And I think that refusal is worth sitting with, whatever you decide to make of the stranger claims. Because the easy thing, the comfortable thing, is to accept the story we were handed. That the past was poor and dark and slow, that a few clever men lifted us out of it, and that everything we have was earned in a fair and honest climb. Elias Thorn looked at the exact same history and saw a robbery dressed up as a rescue. He saw a world where value used to live in the hands of the people who made things, and where it now lives in the ledgers of people who make nothing. And he refused, all the way to his grave, to pretend that the change had made us richer, rather than simply more dependent. You can decide he was a bitter old man who could not keep pace with his own century. Plenty of people did exactly that. Or you can notice how neatly his bitterness maps onto the world you actually live in, the one where the makers are so often the poorest and the owners of paper are the kings. And you can wonder whether the old man was behind his time, or whether he was simply the last person left who remembered a time worth being behind. The rest of it, the stone city, the breathing clocks, the buried core, all of that lives in the space between what we can prove and what we are willing to imagine. I am not going to tell you it is true. I have looked, and the ground gives way under your feet the moment you push too hard on any single claim. But I am also not going to tell you the old man was simply mad, because the pattern he pointed at, the collapse of made value and the rise of borrowed value, is real, and it reshaped the world we still live in, and almost nobody talks about it as a thing that was chosen rather than a thing that merely occurred. So here is where I will leave you. In that same narrow room on that same last night, with the old man's hand on the boy's wrist, somewhere in the walls of a building that no longer exists, or perhaps only in the margins of a ledger that almost no one has read, Elias Thorn is still whispering. And the whisper is not really about a machine. It is about the moment you stop asking who set the clock, and simply start living by it. That is the moment he believed that the old world truly ended. Not in a fire, not in a flood, But in the quiet second, when an entire people looked up at a tower with hands they did not build, keeping a time they did not choose, and decided it must be right, because someone important had told them it was, he spent his whole life refusing that second. And he died still refusing it, with the truth, whatever it was, sealed up in a wall that was warm to the touch, waiting for someone to wind it once, so that it would remember what the rest of us were made to forget.